On today's, on the other hand, we talk with someone working to help Arkansans come together in making their communities better. Here's a sneak preview.
And so I identified and developed a model that focuses on what I would call the white belt moves of communication, the things that are like fundamentals that you could practice your whole life. And if you did, then you would become a black belt in positive communication.
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas that explores politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans through conversations with community leaders. Stay with us as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together.
Hello and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Glenn White. I'm here with my co-host, April Chatham Carpenter. On our podcast, April and I interview community leaders around Arkansas who in some way help toward solutions or to reach across various political or other divides in our community. So interested to hear who we have today. April, who is it? Who's our guest?
Glenn, I'm very excited today about who we have. It's one of my colleagues actually at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, Julien Mirivel. And Dr. Mirivel is a professor in the Department of Applied Communication alongside of me, and we have wonderful professors here. But one thing you don't know, Glenn, is that Julien just last Thursday night won our university's Outstanding Teacher Award. And that's because he has made so much difference in working with students and mentoring, but not just with students, but in the community, actually helping other people better their communication skills. He is a teacher at his heart. And I think you'll see that coming forth. Also was a great researcher as well. But one of the areas that I really wanted to have him on the podcast for, and I actually mentioned it in one of our earlier podcasts that folks may have heard, is that he has this concept called positive communication. And we're going to be exploring that in the podcast today. So welcome to On the Other Hand, Julien.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be spending some time together and engaging in the dialogue.
All right. Well, we're excited as well. So tell us a little bit about what you do as a professor at UA Little Rock and maybe a little bit about how you got into studying and teaching communication.
Well, so I'm a professor of communication at the university. I've been there for 20 years. And I would say studying and reflecting and engaging and teaching communication has been my lifelong passion since I was an undergraduate student, really. Began in the 1990s at the University of Northern Iowa, where you went, actually, April, where you were a faculty. And I really fell in love with the study of human communication and have kept on learning and have kept on studying. And I still love it to this day.
I know this was one of the questions that we originally thought we were going to ask him, but you have a mentor from the Northern Iowa area. In case he listens to this, I would love for you to call him out and tell why he's a mentor, because he also helped, I think, inspire you to study communication.
Absolutely. Yeah, if he's listening, the name is Marvin Jensen. I had an amazing teacher in college who inspired me, but also a lot of other students. I'm actually doing a project now where I'm interviewing his other students. And I'm just realizing that his influence goes well beyond me. He, as one student put it, I did not get a college degree. I got a degree from Marvin Jensen. So I think that puts it in perspective for you. And yes, from him, I learned a lot about interpersonal communication, but also ethics. And so I think my work today really blends these courses that I took with him now more than 25 years ago.
Julien, I appreciate your emphasis on positive communication. I want to hear more about it. One of the reasons I'm so interested in that is, you may not know, I'm a retired psychologist, and in our field of psychology for the last few decades, there was quite a paradigm shift away from more the negative, let's solve the problems kind of thing. That still goes on, but more of an emphasis on positive aspects of improving human behavior. And so I'm kind of interested to see from a different discipline what that looks like for you. And so I'm curious if you can help us understand how you define positive communication, because, frankly, a lot of us might just think of it as being a polite person or being kind or nice.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think it does include those things. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Being polite is at the heart of social interaction, and being kind and nice. I mean, that's something we teach our children. And I do think it illustrates what we mean by positive communication, but it's not the only thing. So if I were to define it, positive communication to me includes anything we say and do, behaviors, actions that are designed to function, if you will, to enrich our relationships with other people. They're behaviors that we would agree are inherently kind of constructive. They move the relationship, the people, the community in a positive direction. And they reflect from the individual, the person who is doing the act of positive communication. To me, it reflects a higher degree of confidence and excellence. So I don't want to get too professorial on you here, but positive communication, from my vantage point, does relate to our ability to engage in some of the virtues that illustrate our capacity. So it's not just being kind or being nice, because it also means being courageous or being compassionate and finding ways of addressing social injustice. So when you think about it in this way, really the way I've kind of realized over the time is that I'm trying to help people move in the direction of these greater virtues. So those are some ways of defining positive communication, and it goes from small things to big things, but I think it's at the heart of how to communicate better with one another.
If I hear you correctly, then yeah, it's not just being nice and polite, although that's part of it, but it also, I'm kind of interpreting that as kind of a problem solving mentality, that it's something you do in a positive way to make things better, to address problems. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, there are, so I guess you can think of it. There are things we do when we communicate that damage relationships. There are things we do when we communicate that create, hostile workplace environments. But there are things we do that don't do that. In my work on positive communication, we're very much interested in what those behaviors are. There are times when we shine. There are times when a father talks to their son and they listen deeply. There are times when we're at work and a leader says something that motivates in a positive way. So positive communication, all of these behaviors, it's kind of a family of behaviors that we would describe as something that really enriches our relationship, that is constructive, that reflects confidence, but also our ability, our capacity. I like to think about capacity.
Sounds like, in a way, it's a way to make sure that you're being effective in your communication and doing what you're trying to communicate. That's part of it too, I guess. Is that right?
That is part of it, being effective. And I think striving to be a better person, and realizing that that's a journey. And so when we focus on positive communication, we're actually focusing on how can I develop who I am? How can I engage with people in a meaningful way, and connect with others, and create both me being self-actualized, but also actualizing the potentiality in myself and others.
Okay, so there's giving back and forth and doing something to lay the groundwork in a positive way for the other person in that dyad, I guess.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this positive communication model that you developed, can you tell us a little bit more about it, what it looks like, how you came up with it, those sorts of things?
Sure. So I would say, I mean, really the journey began now 15 years ago, when I really began to puzzle over some big questions. The questions were exactly kind of what we're talking about. When do we communicate at our best? That's a question that I've been puzzling over. Every day we've got lots of interactions. We say things, we do things, but there are moments when we really truly shine. And I was interested in this kind of extraordinary potential that we have. And we have examples of that. Sometimes people are extremely courageous and their communication reflects that. Sometimes they are extremely compassionate and their communication reflects that. And so really the quest has been to understand, when do we do that? What does it look like? And what kind of impact or effect does it have? So that led me to really kind of a journey of trying to understand and then teach. So I'm a teacher. So my goal has always been to help my students communicate better. And so I identified and developed a model that focuses on what I would call the white belt moves of communication, the things that are like fundamentals that you could practice your whole life. And if you did, then you would become a black belt in positive communication. So I don't have time to go over the whole thing very deeply, but basically the model focuses on 6 behaviors that are connected to principles. I'll just list them for you and you can tell me if there's one that you'd like to explore. But the first principle is that when we greet, we have the ability to create human connection. The second principle is that when we ask meaningful, open-ended questions, we have the ability to discover what we do not know. It's a position of humility. The third principle focuses on complimenting, that when we compliment, we have the ability to affect people, both who they are in the moment, but more importantly, who they become.
Can I
Yes.
stop you for a moment? Clarify which compliment you mean. That could take us in 2 different directions.
So I think of it more like the act of complimenting, not just what you say, but the fact that as a communicator, you have options. One option is I can criticize. An option is I can complain. The third option is I'm interacting with this person. Like, let's say I'm a leader in an organization and I see somebody who's doing a great job. I can abstain from doing that, or I can actually say it. And so for me, it's like that movement. It's a little bit more complex. It's a movement from saying, hey, I have positive ideas about who this person is. And if I express it, it will have that kind of impact. So that's how I think about it, generally speaking.
Very good. Thank you. And what are some of the others then?
So the other 3 are when you disclose, when you have the courage to reveal who you are authentically, genuinely, then you have the ability to deepen your relationships. That when you encourage, principle number 5, you have the ability to use communication as a gift and to give people the support they need during hard times or periods of suffering. And then when you listen deeply, you have the ability to transcend our perceived differences. And so in the model, if you looked at the visual of it, you would find that these 6 principles are together, and at the heart of it, there are the words influence and inspire. And that's because I believe that when we begin to communicate in that way, we create something beyond ourselves. And hopefully that means we create a revolution who we are, which creates a revolution in our relationships, which create a revolutions in our workplaces and our communities. And it just kind of keeps moving outwards that way if we all practice positive communication.
Okay. So another question, and some of the things that you talked about among your 6 principles, I think kind of hinted at this sort of thing. I'm aware, and I'm sure you are too, of all the strong, instinctual, evolved tendencies we have as human beings to be immediately attracted to the negative communications in their environment. It had survival value, so there's a reason it developed that way. It's also why appeals to the populace among people in power that arouse fear and anger are so effective. So, I wonder, given that, how does the positive communication approach that you have take that into account, or maybe pose as kind of a positive counterpart to those more dark, negative urges?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that negative communication is very powerful, right? I once had this conversation with a leader who was kind of telling me this story. You put water in this big bucket, and then he was dropping ink into it, and the ink was supposed to represent negative communication. It was easy to see very quickly how a little bit of negative communication was impacting the group, was impacted other people. I think I just really like this question too. I think the goals are a little different. For me, it's about what it creates. So negative communication is going to create division. The goals are different. We're going to divide. We're going to, my communication is going to negatively impact the people around me. I think when people practice positive communication, they create different kinds of things. It's really the success is in what it does. And positive communication, like if couples engage in positive communication, then they're going to have the opportunity to experience intimacy, closeness, love in ways that people who practice negative communication will simply not. They're going to be in conflicts. They're going to be probably sad. They're going to feel hurt. They're going to be maybe even damaged. So positive communication is just the things we do that are kind of helping us accomplish something that's very different from what negative communication is going to do. Or just take example, if teams engage in positive communication, they're going to feel it. They're going to feel like they're part of something greater than themselves. They're going to feel that they can give to the team, to the work, to the goals of the organization. I mean, I think of my home department where we try to create a great workplace. Well, that means that we feel valued and we feel like the people we work with care about us. And I'll be honest, I can tell you, like, we love each other. And that experience is just different. Doesn't mean we're perfect, doesn't mean we don't have conflicts. It just means that we experience the nature of our work in a very different way. So I think when a person engages in positive communication, their experience of life will be completely different, to be honest, because they're going to be connected to others in ways that maybe some people can't even really understand. They're going to build meaningful relationships and connections. They're going to support each other. And they're going to become, as kind of in your field, with Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, they're going to just simply be more self-actualized. They're going to have access to experiences that others will probably won't. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I think about it. I think in the end, the goals are very, very different in terms of what they accomplish.
Okay. One other thing that this is just, I guess, a matter of personal curiosity, but in our field, one of the things we talk about in trying to overcome the impact of the negative communication is that it takes a lot more positives than it does negatives. You kind of get at that with the ink and the beaker kind of idea. So I wonder if in your field or in your way of thinking of things that you have anything analogous to what people call maybe the 5-to-1 rule. It's like, make sure you try to build in 5 positive moments or interactions in your relationships for every negative, because the negative has such a greater power. Is anything comparable like that in your way of doing things?
Yeah, actually, so if I were to finish that story from earlier about the bowl and the water and the ink, then the next exercise is he would tell his team to put more positive, put more fresh water in to see how long it would take to get rid of the negative. And it just takes forever to just get that negativity out of it. So I do think that what that's teaching us actually is that we have to think about quantity. We have to think about how often we do these things, right? So one compliment in a marriage is not going to cut it. Just as one compliment from your boss may be memorable, but it's probably not going to cut it. I mean, in employee engagement, we ask people to they need to feel praised almost weekly. So if we want higher levels of employee engagement, so quantity does matter to combat what you're describing, which is the kind of the 1-to-5 ratio, right? So we're going to need to do that. And I think the same thing happens with, we've done a lot of work on loneliness these days with my positive communication network. And, it is a question of both quantity and quality. You want quality communication so that when you're together, you can create it. But one moment isn't going to get you out of loneliness. You need lots of opportunities to connect, to feel that your life is a social life, that you have a social life. So point well taken. So yes, and that's what makes it very hard, is that we have to do a lot of it.
I've been writing notes and I know about your model, but I've been thinking about, I'm just being challenged even in my own experiences to be thinking about this as you're talking. And one of the things that I don't know that I remembered hearing before, but I saw it on your website. Also, you state that we each have in us the capacity to use communication to make a positive difference in ourselves and others. You talk about self-actualization and think about that for ourselves, but you mentioned earlier that building capacity for the other person and that development. And I love that, think about that. And I think about, the effects of that, the ripple effects into the community, as you were talking about. As Glenn, was briefly talking about in terms of kind of the negativity, we're going to start moving now our questions into a little bit more of the political aspect, because this podcast is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas, which deals more with political polarization. And obviously our current political and cultural environment suffers from extreme political polarizations, those differences, and a lot of negative communication that we see these days. And I haven't thought before until I was thinking about having you come in onto this podcast about how your model and how positive communication in general could help with this. And I would love for you just to talk about that. So how might the work that you've done in positive communication help with this growing political divide?
Well, that's a great question. And you're right. I do think that when you were reading the statement, we each have in us the capacity to use communication to make a positive difference. I really believe this, and I really think of it like inside each of us, we can and we do engage in negative communication, as Glenn was just mentioning. And what I'm trying to do is figure out ways of moving more in the opposite direction. How can I tap into what I have the potential to do, which is to invite dialogue, which might include, not putting people down who have different perspectives from mine, but welcoming them. So I think my model, is an invitation to engage with one another really differently, actually, and in a way that's different from maybe what people have been doing. And if they chose to go in that direction, because it is a choice, then I think that, again, what they would do is they would experience something different. So in order to reduce our political divide, from my vantage point, really means very practically that we have to improve the way that we communicate with one another. That is at the heart. So let me give you some practical examples. Take the behavior of greeting. That seems really simple. It's just saying hello. It's welcoming connection. It's even initiating connection. So if we want a world if we want to reduce our political divide, one skill set we have to learn to do is to initiate connections with people who are different from us. If we can't do that, then man, the work is going to be hard, because one of the first things is not just waiting for people who are different to connect with us, but actually being willing and to be the initiator of that connection. And even if you just started with that behavior, you'd realize I'm probably not doing that. I'm not doing that enough. So I think of my model as kind of something you can use to think about what are some directions that I could grow.
So I'm thinking about I got a neighbor that I'm not me personally, but imagine that a person has a neighbor that's got an opposite political candidate sign in their yard, and I'm walking by, I see them in their yard. I could say, oh gosh, I don't even want to talk to them, right?
Exactly.
Or I could actually stop and actually make a choice. And how are you doing? Hello, good afternoon, and actually just greet them.
That's right. And that would be a good place to start, right? And that just the simple idea of I'm going to connect with people who are different from me, or I'm going to invite dialogue. I'm going to say to your friend who maybe is, who's leaning differently from me politically, and I'm going to say, hey, let's go grab lunch together. And that simple act of initiating the interaction and being the jump starter will begin to shape a very different experience than your own.
But I'm going to be sitting there at that lunch, not having a clue unless I use some of the other communication behaviors. So what would I do?
That's correct. So when I think about, how do we reduce the political divide? Again, so to me, I go back to the behaviors that I've been talking about. So the second one is about asking questions. We have to learn to be curious about one another and our perspectives and where do they come from and how do we shape them. And so I think just even the simple behavior of asking better questions, which questions are really, in our field, as you know, April, we talk about closed-ended questions and open-ended questions, right? Questions that close down the encounter, like, when is your birthday? do you like the color blue or yellow? Things that, the person is forced to answer very succinctly. But if you ask, so tell me, what are your thoughts on our current political climate? And that might just start an opening in a conversation, or where does your thinking come from? The more we can do that with one another. So this is why my model, I think, is important for this work that you're doing, is actually, if we have a chance of reducing a political divide, it's going to occur because people are making unique, distinctive choices every day in the realm of their interpersonal interactions. If those choices are not taking place, then I don't think you can change the political divide, because it's happening on the ground every day.
So I'm thinking out loud. I'm like, okay, so I asked them a question. So what is what are your thoughts about our current political climate today?
Yep.
They're telling me things. I'm feeling like my, like a cat, like my fur's coming up on the outside because I'm getting triggered by the things that they're saying. What other parts of your model are going to help me actually be able to stay in there with that conversation and remain curious?
Well, I mean, effort for sure. It's going to take some serious effort, especially if you're feeling all these things, right? And I would say that that's an art too. That's not that easy to be able to be willing to say, you know what, today I'm just going to be in a discovery mode. I just want to understand. I just want to capture. This is not about me. It's not about us. It's not about solving the problem. It's not about winning. It's simply about, I want to understand where this person is coming from. And just doing that, what if you just did that one day, and you say, okay, I'm feeling all of these things, which is okay. I'm allowed to feel, but today I'm just going to make it about understanding the other person. And maybe they'll reciprocate. Maybe in 15 minutes, they'll be like, what about you? And because you've modeled deep listening, then in curiosity, maybe they'll become curious about you too. And there, to me, that's where the change begins. That's where the opportunity for real connection would occur. So in my model, there are a lot of behaviors, but I would say for what we're describing here, it's asking, disclosing, and listening. These three skills kind of come together in these conversations. And the mistakes that we make, generally, I would say, without being the expert on this, but the mistakes that we make is we're not curious. we have things we want to say. When we say them in ways that are not neutral, that are sometimes threatening to the other person, that are not considerate. And then finally, we're not willing to really truly listen, because if we did listen, perhaps we would be changed. And that's a pretty scary thought for most of us.
I've heard you talk about before this idea of keeping your hands open.
Yeah.
When we're listening, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how that illustrates this discovery?
Yeah, thanks for asking, April. So, I often have this little exercise that I do when I do talks or when I teach students to try to help people understand what listening really is about. So I ask people to take their right hand or their left hand and make a really tight fist. And that's the frustration we feel when we're in a conflict, So if you think about it, like when you were describing your emotion, the first thing that happens when we feel disagreement is we get tight. Okay. And I like to tell people, well, just now take a second here and just very slowly open your hand. So all the fingers kind of open up and your palm is facing up. So that to me illustrates listening, because listening is all about accepting, and it's all about really opening up. It's opening up my willingness to see things differently, opening up my heart, maybe even opening up my thinking. So that I don't know if it's an ability, but it is a skill set. If you can learn to do that in your interactions, if cumulatively lots of people learn to do that, that's how we're going to reduce political polarization, I think. And that's what I value so much about the work Braver Angel is doing, is I think there are skills that people can learn. And once they experience those moments, they're like, oh my gosh, if I'm curious, something else is happening in this interaction. If I listen deeply, something else is happening in that interaction. I'm not a tight ball. I'm not a tight hand. I've just opened up a little bit.
We're creating relationship with each other. We're creating the ability to potentially problem solve. We're creating a sense of community and value among us. That open hand concepts I use all the time if I have a difficult meeting that I'm in, and I learned this from you, just to keep my hands open underneath my desk, because I don't even see it necessarily that I'm doing it, just because it's a reminder for me that I am trying to understand and not just get my point across. I think it's interesting. Well, I love that you've already seen applications of your model here. You mentioned earlier in a question that Glenn asked about your positive communication network. And I know that you're one of the founders of that network, and it's got communication scholars in it, but I think also psychology's other disciplines are also in that. So I'd love for you to tell what that network is and what its purpose is.
Well, so I would say in 2022, I kind of led the formation of a group of scholars around the United States who were interested in this idea of positive communication, and we decided that we wanted to really create a larger community just beyond us that would get people connected to this topic. So the Positive Communication Network is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to foster a community dedicated to creating better social worlds, which echo the mission of the Department of Applied Communication at UA Little Rock, that April and I are a part of, for all people through positive communication research, through education, and through practice. So a lot of what we do is we do free workshops, free conferences, free celebrations of books and authors, and we do a lot of virtual events to try to spread the power of positive communication and try to educate people so that they can practice positive communication in their personal and professional lives.
I know your recent Positive Communication Network conference, annual conference that you guys have, which is free and it's pretty amazing. Glenn, it might be something that our listeners would be interested in. So eventually we'll need to tell people how to get in touch with your Positive Com network. Is there first of all, is there a website that they can go to? And then
absolutely. So if you go to www.positivecommunication.net, it's even in the word positivecommunication.net. And then you can join our community right on the website. You can see some of the events that we have. And then we also have some of the videos posted from previous conferences. So when people attend, we share the recordings from those events, all in the spirit of trying to continue to educate people about the power of communication.
One of the things I really love about the conference is that it's clear, because I've attended the last two, it's clear that in that conference that you are really, it's not just for students, it's not just for teachers or educators, it's actually for practitioners, people in their community who are trying to make their communities better. What are some of the outcomes of the work of the network or of individuals in that network that you've seen that help communities function better?
You know, that's a great question. I think we actually need to do more to understand what the outcomes of our impact is. So to be honest, I don't know yet the full impact of our work because we really have not measured it. And we're early on, you know, so really our first event began in 2023. So we've only been really doing this for, I would say, okay, so 2 years formally, you could say. But here's my hope. I think that in the last 2 years, we've reached more than 2,000 people who have attended our events in one shape or form or another. We have created connections with people all around the world. So we have people from Australia, Germany, England, France, the United States. Every state has been represented who come together to learn about communication. So I think in that way, and maybe, you know, I don't know if I'm a big dreamer on that, but it's the story of a man who is on the beach and he's watching another person on the beach who the beach is full of all of these starfish that are essentially dying on the beach, right? And there's a man who's like taking the starfish and throwing each starfish at a time into the ocean. But there's like thousands of them. So the man comes to the other person and says, you know, what are you doing? You're never going to save all these starfish. And so he looks at him, picks up a starfish, throws the starfish into the ocean and says, it made a difference to that one. So I think with a positive communication network, that's more like our approach.
Well, that's the first part of our conversation with Julien Mirivel. We'll continue that conversation with Julien in the next episode, so be sure to check that one out.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand, the first part of our conversation with Julien Mirivel.
Listeners with questions or suggestions for On the Other Hand can contact us via the podcast page of the Braver Angels Arkansas website at arkansas.braverangels.org. There you can also find links to all our conversations with other guests. If you enjoy this podcast and this guest, Check out the conversation we had with Mike Starr in episodes 67 and 68. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band. Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, April Chatham Carpenter.
And Glenn White.
Let's each do our part to bring our community closer together.